G'day, ZiggyD here, back with some more Devilian coverage for you guys today, and today I'm going to be talking about what actually Devilian is. So, I've thrown around the term of it being a hybrid action RPG MMO. Now, you might say, but Ziggy, don't we already have some action RPG MMOs? What actually makes this game different from something like Path of Exile or Diablo 3? Well, I'd first like to explain to you guys that Path of Exile and Diablo 3 are not actually MMO action RPGs. They are indeed action RPGs, and they are indeed online games, but they don't really fall under any definition that I can think of for massively multiplayer online. What Path of Exile and Diablo 3 offer is a very traditional Diablo-like action RPG experience where you're able to create a game, create your own instances, and invite people to your party. Once you invite people to your party, you can go questing with them, you can go doing endgame maps with them, you can go rifting with them in Diablo 3, but that's about the extent of the multiplayer component, and you are indeed limited to pretty small party sizes. The MMO definition is pretty wide now. This is kind of happening to gaming in general, that genres in general are extremely confusing. MMOs can be pretty loosely defined, and action RPGs indeed can even be fairly loosely defined. I mean, you could even define something like God of War as an action RPG. What we're talking about here, though, is Diablo-like action RPGs. These are typically isometric, but not always, because now we have things like Borderlands that push the genre in different areas as well. But we have a particular type of combat here with this Diablo-like action RPG. And then on the MMO end of the spectrum, we have a mixture of different things like sandbox games and World of Warcraft-like MMOs. So I recently put out a combat video showing off the combat systems and gameplay in Devilian, and if you were to just look at that one video, the game looks very, very similar to something like Diablo 3 or Path of Exile. In fact, as far as the combat is concerned, it plays very, very closely to any other action RPG you might play. It is isometric, you click to move with your mouse, although it does include WASD movement for the more MMO-inclined players. And then you use a variety of different skills to group up enemies and blast them down, collecting loot and XP from doing so. You see the combat gameplay and you think this looks exactly like Diablo. However, what you can't see when you're just looking at the combat is that the entire metagame surrounding this combat, the entire shell around this one thing, this combat, is actually very much what you'd expect to see in any other MMO, any sort of WoW-like game, World of Warcraft-style game. So when you're playing Devilian, you're engaging in this very action RPG, Diablo-like combat, but you're doing it within this metagame context of a very modern-feeling MMO. So what does this actually mean from a gameplay sense? Well, rather than playing through an action RPG style campaign, which you will typically play through in action RPGs multiple times in multiple difficulties, like for example in Path of Exile, you play through normal, and then you play through cruel, and then you play through merciless difficulty before you approach endgame. Rather than doing that, you're leveling up by doing MMO style questing, which is broken down into various different quest hubs in these kind of open overworld areas. Now in these overworld areas, in which Devilian is separated into different regions which are joined by teleporters, these quite large areas can be home to many other questing players at any one time, as you're running around fighting enemies, talking to NPCs, turning in quests, collecting items, whatever it is that the MMO NPCs have you doing there, you'll see other people around you doing very similar things at the same time. Now, while in Path of Exile and Diablo there might be some shared areas, and you can certainly party up to take combat on and invite people into your game, in an MMO setting, you're seeing these other people around the world with you, whether you're partied up with them or not. And indeed, in very busy times, you might see dozens of people in the one area that you're fighting in at the same time, even if you're not partied up and don't know any of those actual people. So in Devilian, you get this situation where while you're leveling, you're doing very typical MMO questing like you'd expect to see from any modern theme park style MMO. But the actual enemies that you're killing and the quests themselves are very combat heavy, and that combat is exactly like what you'd expect to see in an action RPG. And Devilian has managed to successfully fuse this action RPG combat into every aspect of what you'd expect to see in a modern MMO. So this means we have dungeons, we have raids, we have battlegrounds, we have PvP, and we have your standard MMO-style large city where you can stand around and chat with people, trade, and hit up some NPCs and maybe find some extra quests or groups to play with. So it's really only the combat that is very true to the action RPG formula. However, Devilian does take inspiration from many action RPGs and fuses extra elements into the MMO formula to give it a bit more of an action RPG feel as well. So for example, the loot. The loot in Devilian is very much what you'd expect to see from a theme park World of Warcraft style MMO. It's quite simple. Most of the items are set in stone. You'll find them in specific locations at specific levels, and a lot of them will have preset stats on them as well. Now, however, to make them much more action RPG-like, on top of those set stats and those set item bases, you'll also have items have a bunch of randomized stats, fully randomized stats in a very action RPG style fashion. It's quite a staple of the action RPG genre to have heavily randomized loot, and in Devilian that's certainly the case. You have that set-in-stone MMO style loot that then has a bunch of extra stats on it that randomly roll, so you could have 5 of the exact same chest armors, and then you would have 3 stats on each one of those chest armors that would be completely random. This means that there is a much greater variety of gear, and that it's a little more random than most MMOs, but nowhere near as random or as customizable as most action RPGs. Some other areas in Devilian where you can see the action RPG inspiration take hold are in things like the Eternal Hunting Grounds. Now, the Eternal Hunting Grounds are essentially zones within other regions that have extremely high density of monsters in them. There's tons and tons of monsters in these zones, and they're basically a place for you to group up massive amounts of enemies and nuke them down. Many action RPG players enjoy just kind of jumping in and for a couple hours grinding mobs to try and get some extra drops or to try and level up their character, and this game certainly offers that as well. Now, farming mobs is nothing new to MMOs, but this idea of very mob-dense zones, very efficient farming locations is something very staple to the action RPG genre. Another example is the Endless Tower mode, this survival tower mode, which features both time trials and a survival mode where you see how far you can make it through this increasingly difficult tower. This is kind of a blend of something like Diablo 3's Rift Trials and maybe like Torchlight's Endless Dungeon mode. Another area where we see a bit of influence is in the gear crafting as well. It's possible to use an item on a piece of gear that will randomly select one of the stats and then re-randomize that stat, so completely changing it into another random stat. This is very similar to Diablo 3's Mystic crafting and to the RNG crafting present in Path of Exile. So there's been a lot of confusion about what exactly this game is, because when you just look at some gameplay of Devilian, it very much just looks like another Diablo-style game, another action RPG. It takes a bit more time and a bit more kind of exploration in the game to see that it is also a fully fledged MMO around that combat. So I like to say that it's a 50% action RPG, 50% MMO. Now, there are much more features that are MMO heavy in the game, but let's face it, what are you doing all of the time in this game? You're fighting. So the combat is first and foremost like the focus of the game. It's just done within that MMO context. So although a combat is only really like one feature of the game, it's such a significant feature that it makes it to me like a true hybrid game. It is really a 50% action RPG and 50% MMO. I think this idea is also further supported by the fact that this game doesn't really have anything that's not combat focused. So there is some crafting and stuff like that, but you can do it in your inventory while you're running around hunting down mobs. You don't really have to go chase iron or log trees or go to a crafting station and make furniture or anything like that. There's none of that sort of crafting in the game. There's none of that industry. There's no professions or anything for you to level up outside of combat. There's no non-combat roles. The game also features no Trinity system. There are some support skills and things like that you can use, and you can build with supporting your party in mind, but everyone is building to kill enemies in the very true sense of an action RPG. So hopefully this overview has given you guys a much clearer sense of why I call Devilian an action RPG MMO, why it's a hybrid game and how that sort of comes together, what that actually means for the gameplay. If you guys have any questions about how this game comes together, or if you have some suggestions of future content you'd like to see made for Devilian, then let me know down in the comments below. That's it for now, I'm ZiggyD, and thanks for watching.